One of the privileges of growing up in a Christian home like I did was that my parents insisted that I spent time every day reading a part of the Bible or having a part of the Bible read to me. I'm not entirely sure that as a child I saw that as a privilege, something which I've learnt to value later in life. I think at the time, quarter of an hour doing my stepping stones or my quest notes. I don't know if anyone else remembers those. There's a few nods. The stepping stones and quest notes was quarter of an hour less telly time. Wasn't the deal that I was after at the time, but it's something which I've come to value. Before I was old enough to read, though, my parents used to read Bible stories to me and to my sister, and we had a Bible story book. I've got that shape in my hand because that was kind of the shape of the book. And each page, quite thick, lots of stories in it. Each page had a picture and a bit of and the story in it. And there's four that really stand out in my memory, four that I can remember. I'm sure all the stories I know by now, but four of those pictures. One was the front cover, was Pharaoh's daughter pulling Moses out of the reeds in the basket. Obviously remember that because I saw the book so often. Second one, I've got no idea why I remember it. That was the ram stuck in the thicket when Abraham and Isaac went up the hill for the sacrifice. The third was the Garden of Gethsemane. And I remember very well why I know very well why I remember that one. It's because every time I read that one, I had nightmares of Roman legionaries chasing me. Now, why I thought Roman legionaries might be interested in me, well, I'll let the psychoanalysts amongst you deal with that one later. But the fourth one was this picture. The picture was associated with this story from Gideon. And the picture there was the river running through a field with a whole load of people, men, kneeling down with their face in the water, as it were, drinking from the river. And there in the foreground was the one guy. He's kind of a bit of a man's man type of look about him. On one knee, spear in hand, water in his hand, drinking from his hand. And there's Gideon beside him, looking down kind of approvingly on it. So it's a picture that's really fixed in my mind. And somewhere along the line, that kind of picture got interpreted, or somebody told me, I don't know where it came from, this idea that you hear sometimes about this guy, the lappers, as I tend to call them, the lappers being the people who are the watchful ones, always ready of God's command to look out for the enemy coming over the hill and all the rest of it. I don't know if you've ever heard that interpretation. But it was one I'd heard, and for a long while, it was what stuck in my mind. But of course, it's got nothing to do with this passage, really, has it? That's not what this passage is about at all. This passage is not about human strength. It's about human weakness and divine strength. It's God's power which is on display through and in some ways despite human weakness. So this morning, as we look through these pages together, I want to kind of think of this in three ways. The necessity of weakness for God's people, the perception of weakness with the individual, with Gideon, and the reality of weakness understood by the enemy of God. And we'll spend a bit longer on the first one and hopefully a bit quicker on the last two. Remember the context that we're coming into this passage to the week before Palm Sunday, I think it was. Andy introduced us to the story of Gideon. And the context is that the Midianites have been invading Israel every year for 6 consecutive years. Pillaging the land, taking what they want, reducing Israel to nothing, as it were, and clearing off home again with all the bounty that they'd managed to secure. And Israel has not been able to do anything about that. And then God calls Gideon. And we see in the story, we see Gideon, his reluctance, but eventually he obeys. And we see the last part of what Andy went through with us, when he knocks down the altar to Baal that his father had put up, which was quite a kind of brave act to do. And we're a year later, it's another harvest. So this is the 7th year in a row. And Midian turn up again. But this time, it's different. This time, the Spirit of God comes upon Gideon, and he puts out the call, and this army, these men, begin to come together from the tribes to form this army. And we're told, aren't we, that altogether, if we do the maths, we've got 32,000 men turn up to fight for Israel. Now, 32,000, that's a reasonably impressive figure, isn't it? I reckon Kettering Town would be absolutely delighted if 32,000 people turned up. I think they'd probably be delighted if 32,000 people turned up all season, never mind about for one match. But 32,000 people, it sounds like quite a bit, doesn't it? If we turn to chapter 8 and look at verse 10 and do a bit more maths there, we find out that the Midianite army numbered around about 135,000. Israel is coming into the idea of battle outnumbered something like 4.5 to 1. To borrow a phrase from the last ever episode of Blackadder, this is Operation Certain Death, isn't it? In human terms. This is where Israel are. They are vastly outnumbered. They have not got a hope. So what does God do? He says to Gideon, talk to your troops and say to them, anyone who's a bit nervous about going into battle, when we're outnumbered 4.5 to 1, you can go home. And unsurprisingly, 22,000 pack their bags and go. I reckon I'd be there with them, don't you? 10,000 remain. And God says, take them down to the river. Let them drink. And I'll hold on to just the 300 who drink from their hand, from a cup of the water in their hand. 9,700 more, off you go. What kind of situation are we in now? We've got 300 people. So one of the commentators said, to human eyes, the huge Midian force is far too big ever to be defeated. In God's eyes, the small Israelite force is not yet small enough to achieve Midian's defeat in the way that he is intending. Why? Why has God done this? Well, sometimes when we look at the Bible for reasons, it's quite hard to find a reason. It's dead easy here. It tells us. Chapter 7, verse 2. The key verse for me in this passage. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. You see, God understands the heart of Israel, doesn't he? He understands their true nature, and he understands how quick they are to insert themselves in the place where God should be, and to take the glory that should be his and take it for themselves. You can imagine it, can't you? How easy it would be. 32,000, God does something amazing, but Israel turns around and says, hey, didn't we do well? God reduces Israel to a position of laughable weakness so that they can once again see the power, the faithfulness of their God. In their rebellion, which we know is the cycle of Judges, this constant turning away from God, God is using this opportunity to show them the extent of their weakness and to help them to understand that it is only when they turn to him that they can be saved and can find and can be restored. It's the grace of God who they've been called to serve and to represent the rest of the nations, which is at work here. You know, there's a powerful lesson in that, isn't there? That sense of weakness. And I couldn't get away from the feeling that how that comes back to so much of what we were talking about last week around the Easter story. About that understanding that we can only be saved and rescued when we recognise our weakness and our dependence on God. And we avoid that temptation to take the glory ourselves. I've just seen this here, the man on the middle cross book. I don't know if you've seen the video yet. It was widely circulated, but the Alistair Begg video clip that goes with that, when he's talking about the man on the middle cross. But if you watch the little bit at the beginning, and I hope if you do watch the clip, make sure you do get one with the little bit of introduction on it. And Alistair Begg is talking about the way we so often talk about our salvation. And we say things like, I believed, I turned to Christ, I did this, I did that. And he said, and what Alistair Begg says, we get the wrong pronoun. It's not I, it's he. What has he done? He saved. It's all about him. Israel needed to understand that. Israel needed to understand that it's all about God and his saving actions. And that's where their redemption, their future, was. It's amazing that Israel needs to be reminded so often, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I find Judges a really frustrating book of the Bible to read. Because we go round and round and round this same cycle, don't we? The people of Israel turn their backs on God. They rebel against him. Then calamity comes across to them and they cry out to God and God rescues them time and again. And then they forget all about it and off they go again. Kind of why? Why do they keep repeating this? Well, we're not told exactly, but I think we can surmise, can't we? You know, they're in the middle of a culture that's opposed to them. It's always difficult to go against the flow, isn't it? To be different. There's always that temptation to compromise, to get on with people, to use a more modern term, to be relevant. The desire to fit in. Or perhaps it's around, things to do, again, that's something Andy was talking about last time, the temptation of the sensual and the sexual, with all the contents of what happened with the Baal cult. The desire maybe to have more than we've already got. Maybe it's about laziness. It's hard work being obedient, isn't it? Sometimes. Ultimately, I suggest it comes down to the thing that is central to all our fallen natures. Right there from the beginning of the Garden of Eden. Ultimately is the desire to be in control of our own destiny, to feel free to do what we want to do when we want to do it, because obedience doesn't come naturally to any of us, does it? John Piper says this, he says, doing what you feel like, doing when you feel like, doing it has never led to a life of liberation, but only to a life of bondage. And that's what Israel discover time and time again. But they're slow learners, like many of us are. And it's only when we begin to understand that, as I've called it, the necessity of weakness, that our future, our freedom, comes in coming to God in weakness, that we begin to understand true freedom. So we have the necessity of weakness. But then we have the perception of weakness. And we begin to talk about the individual, about Gideon himself. And the question, why does God retain the 300? Why doesn't God just put on a show? Come on, Israel, gather round, watch me at work. Bang, that's Midianites dealt with. Now have you got the message? Why does God retain the 300? Again, a quote from one of the commentators. The Israelites need to recognize that only God is able to deliver Israel. That he certainly has the ability to do, but that he also calls them to cooperate with him in the actions he is taking. One of the great truths of history and throughout the Bible and throughout church history is that God has chosen to work through his people to achieve his purposes. The actions and the glory that go with that remain his, but he chooses us to be his co-workers in achieving that. Which, when I look in the mirror in the morning, is quite an incredible thing. Because I kind of think, really? Really? Is that really the way it is? I guess most of us are familiar with the term imposter syndrome. We know what that's all about. For some of us, it comes and goes. For some of us, it kind of lives with us like a member of the family. It's always there, ready to greet us in the morning, isn't it? I don't know what the original Hebrew for imposter syndrome might be. I reckon that's one you can ask Mark afterwards. I'm sure he'd be delighted with that. But I reckon that Gideon knew all about imposter syndrome as the person who God has called to act for him here. You know, we look through the story of Gideon, don't we? Where did we first meet Gideon? He's hiding down a winepress, isn't he? This is not a man of great courage. He's hiding down a winepress, trying to thresh wheat down a winepress. When it's made clear to him that, you know, he's told, you are God's man, his response is, well, hang on, my clan's the weakest and I'm the lowest in the clan, you can't mean me. And then when he does get the message and he goes and does what God says and he destroys the altar of Baal, he does so by night. It's almost like you can hear Gideon saying, okay, God, I'll do what you say, but please don't let anyone see me doing it. And then when we come here, and it tells us that the Spirit of the Lord has come upon him. He calls the tribes to follow. He sends the message out. The army begins to gather. Just at the point when it looks like we're ready to go, we see this hesitation with Gideon. And he goes, actually, God, can we have another conversation about this? And we hear this familiar story about the fleece. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, Gideon's putting God to the test here. He's asking the question. It's that sense of caution, that sense of self-doubt comes through. He knows the answer. Actually, it says there in verse 36, as you have said. He already knows what God is saying. And then he puts the fleece out, and yet the fleece is wet and the ground is dry. And then he comes back for a second go. And now he knows he's pushing his luck because he says, you know, let not your anger burn against me, God. God is patient and God is gracious with Gideon. We don't actually hear any response in terms of words from God. But the fleece is dry and the ground is wet. Gideon gets the sign that he asks for. And perhaps now Gideon is going to walk forward with confidence, but we see that its nerves are still there. And later on, when it comes down to going down to the camp, he takes his servant Purah because he is afraid. You know, when you look at the character of Gideon, it's a really complex mix, isn't it? It's a complex mix of doubt, uncertainty, questioning, but faith all at the same time. Gideon kind of perception of himself as weak and inadequate. Yet he is God's chosen leader. And through Gideon, God does amazing things. I wonder how many of us recognise some of that in ourselves. But it's the same point as before, isn't it? It's about his strength, not ours. We're all called in some way or another to God's service. And I guess many of us sometimes look at that and kind of have the perception that we're not up to the job. His strength, not ours. You know, the quality about Gideon that stands out to me that makes him the right person is that despite all his fears, all his misgivings, his questioning and his doubt, he obeys. And he does what God calls him to do. And in doubtful obedience, God does amazing things, doesn't he? What limits are there on what God can do through each one of us if we allow his strength to work through us and not allow the barriers of our own worries and inadequacies and self-perceptions, be they real or just in our heads, if we follow his calling? I'm reminded of a book title, a book I read a while ago, but it just seemed to be apt and summarised the point quite nicely. And the book title was this: if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. And finally, we come to the reality of weakness and the enemy. And the last couple of verses here of the passage we read, verses 13 and 14 in chapter 7. Let's read them again. So when Gideon came down, this is onto the edge of the enemy camp, behold, a man, one of the Midianites, was telling a dream to his comrade. And he said, behold, I dreamed a dream. And behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. You know, there's a great irony in those last two verses, isn't there, what we've read there. In that the private, low-ranked soldier of the Midian army understands so immediately what Israel was so slow to learn. That if God is fighting for Israel, then it doesn't matter how big that Midian army is. Israel will prevail because God will prevail. And the enemy knows it. And we think back to last week, don't we? To Easter, to remembering the Easter story. And what is one of the key things about the Easter story? That, you know, no matter what our doubts, no matter about the times that we fail to place God at the centre of it all, no matter at the times when we get it wrong, or with the times when we are faced with circumstances that seem to overwhelm us, we have a God of strength to whom there are no limits, and an enemy who already knows he's defeated. It's quite a thought, isn't it? A God of unlimited strength and an enemy who knows that he's defeated. To finish, I'm going to read some verses from 2 Corinthians. So it's a kind of, instead of a prayer really, verses I'm sure we're all familiar with. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And Paul is talking about his thorn. We don't really know altogether what that thorn is, but it's this weakness that he perceives. There's a whole new sermon there. But this is what Paul writes. chapter 12, verse 9. But he, God, said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.